Your AI agents do not just depend on models anymore, they depend on government policy. That sounds dramatic, but this is exactly what the Fable 5 situation exposed. The US government told Anthropic to restrict Fable 5 and Mythos 5 from foreign nationals. Anthropic could not verify nationality in real time, so the models went dark for everyone. That was not an open source AI ban, but it was a warning shot for anyone building on one of the Frontier APIs. Because your stack can be working in the morning and cut off by policy that afternoon. So the real question is not, did the US ban open source AI? It didn't. The real question is worse. Can Frontier AI now change faster than your roadmap? And the answer is yes. Now let me show you why this matters without turning it into political theater. June 9th, Anthropic released Fable 5 and Mythos 5. The same underlying model, but different access rules. Fable 5 was the public model wrapped in heavier safeguards, but Mythos 5 had fewer safeguards and was limited to trusted Project Glasswing partners. So think of Fable like the public version of a very powerful engine, but with a bouncer standing at the door. If your request looked risky, the bouncer could block it, refuse it, or rotate you to a weaker model instead. That system is the whole story. Because once the bouncer became the weak point, the model stopped being just a product issue. It became a national security issue. The reported trigger was an Amazon researcher finding a way to bypass Fable safeguards on vulnerability-related prompts. In one example, the model showed code that exposed a vulnerability that could be exploited. Now, Anthropic's argument was basically that this was very, very narrow. This was not some unique doomsday capability. And that is the part builders should pay attention to. Not the drama, not the politics, the speed. On June 12th, the US government applied export controls to Fable 5 and Mythos 5. The order required Anthropic to restrict access to foreign nationals inside and outside the US. Anthropic could not reliably check nationality in real time, so both models were pulled for everyone. Now, this is the event. And this is where a lot of people get the story wrong. This is not the government deleting open source AI from the internet. No open weight model was removed from Hugging Face, no GitHub repo was wiped. And it wasn't just a general blanket ban on running local models. So if someone tells you the US government banned open source AI, that's too simplistic. But if someone tells you this means nothing, that is also wrong because the mechanism matters. Frontier AI got treated less like normal software and more like strategic technology. The same policy logic you see around advanced chips, export controls, and national security capability. And once that logic enters the room, the lever is not just the model quality anymore. The lever is access. So who gets the model? Who is blocked from the model? And who decides the rules? And how quickly the provider has to obey. That is the new risk that we're facing. Not that every model is going to disappear tomorrow, but the strongest model in your workflow can now become conditional. Conditional on your nationality, on where you live, and on your compliance. And if your automation depends on that model being available every single day, you have a hidden single point of failure. So can the US government ban open source AI? The case doesn't provide a full open source ban. It proves something narrower and more useful. Frontier model access can be restricted fast. And that is the closest test case we've seen so far. So there are 3 ways to read into it. The first read is the safety read. If a frontier model can be pushed into helping with exploit work, fast intervention may reduce harm. Now that's the strongest good faith argument for the restriction. The second read, though, is the overarching read. Anthropic argued the issue was narrow, and that other models could reproduce similar outputs, and that by pulling a commercial model over this kind of finding sets a dangerous precedent. That is the strongest argument against it. Now, the third read is one that us builders need to care about: unintended consequences. Because when US frontier access becomes unpredictable, builders aren't going to stop building, they route around the outage. Some of us will go cheaper, some of us will go to local models, some start testing Chinese models like GLM 5.2 and Kimi because the door is open and the cost is lower. And before someone turns that into a cultural war argument, that is not the point. China's not risk-free, different jurisdiction, different government risk, and different trust problem. But builders are pragmatic. If one road closes, we're going to look for another one. Now that's the uncomfortable takeaway. Restricting US frontier models can push some builders towards non-US alternatives. Not because those alternatives are perfect, but because builders route around failure. And that brings us back to your stack. If your AI agents depend on one US frontier API, a policy directive can change your access before you have time to redesign your workflow. Maybe next time, it's not a full shutdown, maybe it's quieter than that. Maybe certain prompts get routed to a weaker model, maybe certain regions get gated, maybe usage moves behind credits, and maybe compliance rules change. This is where your automation starts failing in weird edge cases. So that's what really makes this dangerous. The failure does not have to be loud, it can be silent. Your agent still runs, the API still responds, the dashboard still looks green, but the model underneath is now weaker, slower, and more restrictive. That's just not the model risk, that is policy risk. And the real question is, should I panic switch? No, that's the wrong lesson here. If you switch your entire stack from one dependency to another dependency, you didn't solve the problem, you just changed the logo on the risk. The real vulnerability is single vendor, single jurisdiction dependency. That is the phrase that we need to remember. Single vendor, single jurisdiction, single failure point. So here's the decision rule. If a workflow is revenue critical, customer facing, or hard to manually recover, it needs a fallback across vendor jurisdiction and deployment mode. That doesn't mean that every toy workflow needs 5 backups. It means the workflows that matter need a fallback path. If the model goes dark, what runs instead? If this provider changes access rules, what degrades gracefully? If the jurisdiction becomes messy, where can the workload move? Now, this is the architecture question now, not politics, architecture. Because your AI stack now sits inside a policy system that you do not control. And you definitely don't want to discover that during an outage. Model the failure now on paper before it's forced on you. Ask 3 questions. If the provider goes dark this afternoon, what breaks? If this model starts routing flagged requests to a weaker model, what silently gets worse? If access becomes regional, credit-based, or nationality gate, what's your backup path? Those 3 questions will tell you very quickly whether you have resilience or just vibes. If you build with AI agents, please subscribe. I'm going to cover the tools, the model shifts, and the architecture decisions that keep your workflows alive when the platform underneath changes. Model the failure now, and I'll see you in the next one.